Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Shawn Wong, who I just had a wonderful conversation. So Shawn didn't do a traditional lecture. Shawn and I just had a conversation about his coming to be a scholar, a teacher, a novelist, a writer, and he's a fabulous and accomplished writer. Shawn's going to talk about his process of becoming a writer, his process as a young student when he identified as as a writer. He found his identity, and he actually found himself as the first Asian American writer when he was a young man at age 19. Um, Shawn, I invited him in part because he's going to give a gift to the class. Back in September 11th, 2001, we had a national crisis in our country, and Shawn wrote a poem for the campus community on September 11th. And he wrote that and kind of delivered that for the campus community. When I asked Shawn to be a part of the course and to talk with me about the course, I asked him also to write a poem for all of you for 2020 and to give as a gift to the class. And that's what Shawn is going to do. So we're going to talk about that writing process. We're going to talk about him as a writer. And we're going to talk about the fact that he's going to give all of you, the students in this class, a gift of a poem that he's going to read at the end of the class as well. So I give you Shawn. He's interesting. He's a creative person. He's a creative writer. He's also a drag racer. Listen for when he talks about racing cars. I've got a couple of questions for you to think about. One, as you listen to Professor Wong, he talks about overcoming challenges, staring at a blank page and not being able to write. My question for you is, can you describe a time when you encountered an academic challenge that you didn't think you could overcome, but then you overcame it? So can you think of a time when you faced an academic challenge that you didn't think you could overcome, but then you overcame it? So describe that challenge and how you overcame it. A second question, what or who inspires you to be creative and engaged? What or who inspires you to be creative? Shawn talks about the people that most inspired him. There were other writers who inspired him to be creative and live the life of someone who's creative, live the life of a writer. So what or who inspires you to be creative and engaged in your own life? So thank you for listening to Shawn. Thank you for listening to me. And enjoy my discussion with Shawn. He's a fascinating person. And in the end, he's going to come back and give a gift to you all. Thank you. Hi, everyone. We get a moment to actually spend a bit of time with Shawn Wong, and it's my honor, Shawn, to have you have a discussion with our class 2020. Thanks for joining us, Shawn.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be fun.
This is going to be fun. So, Shawn, a question to start with. Before I ask you about your experience at Berkeley, tell me, growing up, how you got to UC Berkeley, and how did you make your college choice? So think about yourself as a young man thinking about when and how to go to college. What decisions did you make, and how'd you get to Berkeley?
Well, I grew up in Berkeley. I was born in Oakland, but we lived in Berkeley. My parents were students. My father was a graduate student at Berkeley in engineering, and my mother was an art student. And they were international students from China. And I was born and I grew up in Berkeley, and so you're sort of pretty much destined to go across the street to Berkeley. Graduated from Berkeley High School. I mean, my father's job, we traveled a lot, but we ended up back at Berkeley. And after graduating from high school, I actually wanted to go away from home, like most students. So I applied to San Francisco State, and I didn't want to get too far away from home, but I decided, I graduated in 1967, which is the summer of love in San Francisco. And I decided I needed to be in San Francisco. So I went to San Francisco State for 2 years and then transferred back to Berkeley in my junior year and graduated from Berkeley.
So to be in San Francisco and to be at Berkeley in the 60s means something to us. I'm not sure what that's going to mean to our students, but to describe what Berkeley in the 60s or San Francisco State in the 60s was like for a student at that time.
San Francisco State, and being in San Francisco, of course, was really exciting. You know, it was the beginning of, rock music, and a lot of the bands lived in San Francisco, and the Haight-Ashbury and all of that sort of 60s movement was happening right on campus in San Francisco. So it was a very exciting time to be there. And I took my first poetry writing class, as a freshman at San Francisco State. And I thought at the time, I was the world's best poet. I do have to point out that the average age at San Francisco State at that time was 28 years old. It was very much a commuter school. It had, the students were generally older. There were some returning vets from Vietnam War. And I remember sitting in my first poetry writing class with an Irish poet named James Liddy was the professor. And I thought I was really good. And then I read one of the poems by one of the first students to offer up her poem. And I realized at that time, I was the worst poet in the class and that I better get good before it was my turn to show my poetry, because these students had actually been out and lived a life. I was 18. I hadn't done anything and they were actually writing about life experiences. So I had to reach in pretty quickly and try not to embarrass myself.
There's a culture of activism around the campus at the time. Were you involved? What was that like?
Yes, and it escalated pretty quickly. I guess right in the middle of my freshman year there, and certainly in my sophomore year, when all of the demonstrations on the Vietnam War and ethnic studies, the creation of ethnic studies. San Francisco State had the very first ethnic studies program. I think we went through 4 school presidents in 1 year because the demonstrations caused an uproar on campus, and the university presidents at the time refused to bring the police onto campus. And each one was fired by the governor, Reagan, until the president, S.I. Hayakawa, came into office, and he allowed the police to come on campus, and it turned the demonstrations into essentially a police riot. And eventually, I decided to leave San Francisco State because it had become sort of a police state. It's a very small campus, and every building you went into, you were searched. And so I said, I have an idea. I'm going to go back to Berkeley. And so I applied to Berkeley and transferred to Berkeley, which of course was like jumping from the frying pan right into the fire. I arrived in Berkeley in 1969, and it was on strike and shut down at various times and on fire. Buildings were set on fire. The National Guard came on campus, tear gassing students. My entire college career essentially was upside down and interrupted by demonstrations and strikes, student strikes, faculty strikes. But I wouldn't have it any other way.
How did you decide to position yourself in light of all the chaos that was going on? Were you active in the protests? Did you stand away from them? How did you position yourself as a young student at Berkeley at that time?
I think, Berkeley was a hotbed of student unrest and demonstrations. And one of the things that I think you couldn't really stand aside, essentially the Vietnam War and the draft, affected every young man on campus. There was no getting away from it, right? And for a while, you could get a student deferment, and you kept telling yourself, well, the war will be over by the time I get out of high school. Oh, the war will be over by the time I get out of college, And because of that situation we found ourselves in, you had to make a statement. You had to take a position. There was no other way. And I was certainly on the side of protesting the war and for the creation of ethnic studies. It's where we learn, the right names to call ourselves. Asian Americans went from being Orientals to Asian Americans, and Blacks went from, started calling themselves African Americans, and we were all fighting for the creation of ethnic studies and Asian American studies and Black studies. And so both on a kind of academic level as well as just social justice level, everyone had to take some kind of position.
Do you see any, 2020 is a pretty unique year for our students. Do you see any similarities between Berkeley in the 60s and the kinds of things that are going on, COVID notwithstanding, but some of the things that are going on in the United States now and things that are going on and around college campuses? You're a professor here. Do you see any through lines between what was going on then and what's going on now?
Oh, absolutely. I think the level of activism and you can certainly see it in the students. Obviously it's a sort of different kind of activism, but it's the same spirit. You have to, and I think COVID is certainly part of it. It affects everybody. No one is left untouched by the quarantine or the virus. As they say over and over, the virus doesn't take a political position and or a racial position or an economic position. So we're all affected by it, and you have to make a decision on how you're going to approach not only what you do for society, but also what you do for yourself. Just walking out the door, right? I got to put on a mask. I got to protect people around me. I got to protect myself. That, and of course, the social unrest and the issues of Black Lives Matter, and it's not Black Lives Matter doesn't just matter to Blacks, and we, our social identity is tied to our ability to define what social justice means to each one of us. So, we have social unrest in the streets. We're at war, abroad. We're at war against the virus, and no one is left untouched. It's almost a mirror image, I think, of the 60s and 70s.
And in light of all that was going on at Berkeley in the 60s, you decided as a 19-year-old that you wanted to become a novelist. You wanted to become And so the first part of this question, so what led you to decide that you then knew that you wanted to become a novelist? And you went in search of Asian American writers, and you came in contact with the first Asian American writer. So tell us, what made you decide at 19 that you wanted to be a novelist? And who was the first Asian American writer that you came in touch with as a 19?
Yeah, I was, I think, fortunate in the sense that I remember on the Berkeley campus just sort of thinking, what do I really want to do? And I decided that at my age, in my early 20s, I decided you should try to do what you really want to do first. And so I decided I wanted to be a novelist. And then the exact moment that I decided that, I also realized I was the only Asian American writer I knew in the world. No teacher had ever mentioned the name of an Asian American writer or assigned a book by an Asian American writer. And none of my American literature professors could even think of an Asian American book, right? And so, and at that time, we didn't have Asian American studies either. And so I realized, how can I be the only, just sort of think of the another situation where, let's say you're a young African American writer and you would have a whole literary history to research and study. You could take a class in African American literature at that time. There was only one class, but you could take, and you could look up in the encyclopedia that there are people like Langston Hughes and Ralph Ellison. But for an Asian American, there was nothing. And I was told that there was nothing, which I couldn't believe. Chinese Americans at that time had been in the country 150 years. We must have written something.
Poetry.
Somebody wrote a poem. Somebody wrote a short story. And so I said, well, I'm not, I have to prove them wrong. And so I went out and started searching, and I found them. They were not hard to find. Their books had gone out of print. Some of the writers were still alive. I got my little tape recorder out, and I interviewed them. And keep in mind, there was no class, there was no credit, there were no grades, but I sort of decided in my head, I'm going to major not only in English, I'm going to major in Asian American literature, except there are no teachers. There's just me.
What made you decide that you were, now you're truly identifying yourself as a writer, as a novelist? What turned for you? What made you decide I'm truly a writer? And so much that you're the first Asian American writer that you've encountered. What was going on in your either your skill set, your mind, your heart? How did you know? Well,
at San Francisco State, as I mentioned, I took poetry writing class, and then later I took a class by Kay Boyle, a great American writer who had, at that time was in her late 60s. And she had published, 30, 40 books in her lifetime. And she made a big impression on me. She felt that I had something to say. And she also demanded that everything we write had to be relevant to what was going on in our world. We couldn't write fantasy books with unicorns or, and since school was closed a lot, like it is now for us, professors, because of schools shut down because of demonstrations, professors would often have classes in off-site locations, basement of a church or in their homes. I had the great, at Berkeley, I had the great English professor, Stephen Greenblatt, who had his classes in his house. He was a young assistant professor. And Kay Boyle did the same thing. She had her classes in her home. And I think she gave me the kind of confidence to write. And so after I graduated from Berkeley, I went back to San Francisco State and to graduate school in creative writing there, and worked sort of under her tutelage. It was a very old world master and apprentice style rather than professor and student style.
You actually, probably something we wouldn't do now, but you actually lived with her
she lived in this 4-story Victorian mansion in the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco. And she had her own separate apartment on the top floor. And she rented out 3 rooms to people. And I was the only student who rented a room from her. As a professor now, it would just appall me to think that I had a student living in my house. But it was an interesting experience because, as I said, it was just like master and apprentice, old world style, where apprentice blacksmith lives with the blacksmith's family and learns the trade. And what she taught me was something you don't learn in graduate school, which is how to live your life as a writer. Not just to learn to write, but how to live your life. I moved into a house that was a literary world. She wrote every day for hours. There was a library in the house. It was a very literary world. And the advantage was that I had 24-hour access to her But the disadvantage is she has 24-hour access to you as a student. And so, you know, she would say things like, my bedroom was right underneath her. She would say things like, I didn't hear you writing last night. Because you used a typewriter, right?
Typewriter, we hate the data, but we were using manual typewriters.
Yeah, I had one that actually plugged into the wall. But, you know, but, you know, I got to, you know, her house was a receiving place for artists and musicians and writers, and famous writers came and went, you know, and I'd often be the one opening the door. She communicated regularly with Samuel Beckett, and she would let me read his letters. You know, I'd be sorting out the mail for the people who lived there, and there'd be a letter from Beckett, and she'd say, "Oh, I forgot my glasses. Can you read it to me?" You know, so that's the world I lived in. And there's another funny story, which is one day I came home from school and ran into her in the foyer of the house, and I put my books down on the table, and on top was The Dubliners by James Joyce. And she goes, "Oh, I see you're reading Jim's book." And I go, "Jim?" And she goes, "Yeah," because I knew Jim in the 20s in Paris, and when she was a young writer. And if you look at pictures of the Cafe Society at that time, she's sitting there having coffee with Hemingway and Joyce and people like that. And she said, "Yeah, there's a filing cabinet downstairs. And there's letters from Joyce in there. You can look through them if you want." So that was I think that was the world of literature that really mentored me and inspired me to become a writer.
Mm-hmm. So you're one step removed from some of the great writers. Tell our student, Shawn, what does it mean to live the life of a writer, live life as a writer or a creative? Is it the same thing? Because you talked about creative people coming together. Talk about creativity and writing. What does it mean to live a life of creativity and a life of writing?
Well, you know, I've always enjoyed writing, and it also torments me and tortures me. You know, students understand the feeling of staring at a blank screen or a blank piece of paper, and it's your job to put words on that paper. It's not an easy task. It's hard. And I enjoy that struggle, you know, that struggle with my own creativity, my own honesty about myself. At the end of the day, you know, when I'm looking at my work, I want to be able to say to myself, you know, when I read what I wrote, that's exactly what I meant to say in my heart and in my mind, you know. And I was able to capture that, and you sort of live for those moments. It's not easy to, you know, you have to revise and revise and revise, but you eventually get there. And I think that that feeling of being able to pinpoint accurately what it is you want to say and how you want to say it is incredibly satisfying in that moment of creativity.
You said once that everything you write needs to reflect what you believe. What do you mean by this? And what do you say to students with regard to everything you write, you need to believe? What does that mean?
I want students to sort of not just look at the assignment, you know, I want them to rise above the assignment in a way so that they end up writing something for themselves, right? The things that they want to say on a page have more meaning to them than what the assignment asks of them, right? So I want to see that kind of commitment to the word on the page, you know, that I often say to my students that their writing should always indicate what it is they're trying to learn, not what it is they already know. You know, that's sort of one. Number two, to tell the truth, not the facts. All right? Tell the truth, not the facts. And number three, and this is especially for, I think, when you're writing about yourself, for example, you can't change anything. Many of our students have faced some kind of trauma in their lives, and you can't change anything that happened to you in the past. But as a writer, you can control the message of that, right? And that gives you a power over whatever that trauma is, whether it's a personal loss or what other issues people are struggling with, or as a writer, you can control that message, or rather than have that event control you. So like the COVID, we can let it control us, but as a writer, you can also use your skill to help others too, as well as, to learn from it,
You signed, speaking of struggling with writing, you signed a contract with Simon & Schuster for American Knees, your novel. And you signed that contract after you had written 100 pages.
Right.
Tell the story of signing that contract just partway through the book and what it means to write under that kind of pressure.
Yeah, well, there was two kinds of pressure. I wrote this book. I had 100 pages, which I thought, were pretty good. So I sent it off to my agent. My agent sold it to Simon & Schuster, gave me a large advance and said, you have to deliver it in a year. And the other side of the story, just to add to the pressure, was my late wife was battling cancer. And she said to me one day, when she was in remission and we were on our way to Hawaii during spring break, she said to me in a very jokingly way, why can't you write a book I can read at the beach? And basically in parentheses was, you just write those academic books, no one's interested in. And I remember thinking to myself, you don't think I can write a beach book? I'll show you I can write a beach book. And so, and I also wanted to make her laugh. As when you're a caregiver for somebody battling cancer, you feel very helpless. There's very little you can do other than just be supportive. And so I decided, well, my role was to make her laugh. And so I decided to write a comedy, a romantic comedy. And the other part of that story is after 11 months, guess how many pages I had of the book? Any guesses?
120.
120, right on the money. And I had to turn it in a month.
So you were staring at a lot of blank pages. I'm sorry for laughing. You were staring at blank pages for a long time.
And so the other part of being a writer is you face failure in the face all the time. Every day, a sentence fails you, a paragraph fails you. You fail yourself, and all you can think about is failure. And there I am after 11 months. I've been paid, and the Rockefeller Foundation came to my rescue. I get a letter in the mail saying they granted me a 1-month residency at their compound in Bellagio, Italy, on the shores of Lake Como. I didn't even know what that was. I'd forgotten I applied for it. And my wife encouraged me. She goes, I'm doing fine now. Just go and write the book, And so I wrote the entire book in 1 month. And I turned it in on time. And the date that I was supposed to turn it in, April 1st. April Fool's Day. And I turned it in on time. And I went from thinking that I was a failure and a fraud to thinking now I'm the greatest writer in the world. I turned in the book and my editor at Simon & Schuster's returned the manuscript to me. There was not one page in the manuscript that didn't have her comments written on it. And so I ended up revising the book 6 more times over 10 months. But we got there. And that process, I think, was really interesting and unique. But, a lot of people helped me along the way. While I was at Bellagio, one of the other writers who was there was Susan Sontag. And I remember her asking me one day, she goes, "How's the writing going?" Which is nothing, you never want to ask a writer that because it's never going well. And I said to her, I'm the worst writer in the world. and Susan said to me, she just gave me one piece of advice. She says, "When I was writing my novel, The Volcano Lover, I reread a chapter that I wrote, and I realized I had used the word really 24 times. Really dark, really far, really painful." And she's looked at me and she goes, "Have you ever written that badly?" And I looked at her and I go, "No." And she said, "You feel better now?" And I go, "Yeah, thanks." That's a really generous suggestion or comment from, at that time, she had published 15 books, and of course is a literary icon.
You've talked about Italy, your experiences there. One of the things that you've done for our students, Shawn, is go to Rome, our Rome Center, and take students to Rome. And I don't know what you do there. I just know that students come back and talk about it as one of the more transformative experiences of their lives.
Yeah, back in 1997, when I was in Italy for the first time at the Rockefeller Center, I'd never been to Italy in my life. And then I found out that UW had a Rome Center. No one told me. I'd been at the U for 10 years. No one told me there's a Rome Center. And so I got it in my head. Somebody has to teach there. It better be me. and at the time, it was mostly architecture students and art students. And so I designed a kind of art studio class for writers. And in 97, I brought a group of creative writers there, and we just used Rome as an art studio class. Instead of sketchbooks, we had journals, and we explored the city, and that class has been going on ever since. I don't always teach it, but I managed to teach in Rome 15 times since then. And so just because I'm the kind of self-sacrificing professor who would do that.
You've done good work in Rome. You've done good work with our students. Now, something else that I think our students should know about you, they may not be Facebook friends with you, but I went on your Facebook page, and there you are standing in front of a 1968 Camaro. And I think it's purple.
Purple, husky, purple.
It's a husky purple Camaro. And you used to race a car like that. Is that the car that you used to race? So you're riding, and
I just bought that car.
Did you just get it?
Yeah, I call it a COVID purchase. When you go crazy and you go, I need a '68 Camaro. No, but I did drag race from '77 to '97 for 20 years. I had corporate sponsors. I raced a 1970 Dodge Challenger and a 1966 Ford Mustang. I had 2 different race cars. And, won the National Hot Rod Association Championship one year. Won a lot of races. I always wanted to be a racer. And I'm always sort of very competitive. I was a competitive swimmer, competitive water polo player. And I loved working on cars. And so I, just this year, after a 23-year absence, I decided to go back to drag racing. And a lot of the people that I used to race with are still racing, which is why you can't get a senior discount at the drag strip. there's no senior discount because all of us are driving cars that are like 50 something years old.
As long as you stay off of I-5, stay on the track.
Yeah. But it's great. It's great fun. There's a lot of camaraderie, and it's a great outlet, particularly these days. It's pretty.
I'll ask you about the Red Badge project.
Yeah,
Students may not know about that. Tell us about how you started or co-founded the Red Badge project, and what that means to you. Describe that for our students.
So 7 years ago, I was contacted by a friend of mine, actor Tom Skerritt. Tom Skerritt was in, for students who don't know, he was in Top Gun and Alien.
River Runs Through It.
River Runs Through It, and other films. Excuse me. He contacted me and he said, Shawn, there's a statistic that 22 soldiers and veterans are committing suicide daily. And one of the reasons that's listed in this news article that he read was that family members and vets who had attempted suicide said no one was listening to their story. And he says, we're writers, we know how to teach storytelling. Let's start a workshop. You, me, and 2 other screenwriters, let's start a workshop and just teach them how to tell their story. And so the great thing of having a movie star as your founder is that he can contact people and people will listen to him. And so he contacted a general he knew in Washington, D.C. And he said, we'd like to start a storytelling workshop at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Lakewood, Washington. And general said, great idea. And then he says, I'll call the commander. And general calls the commander at the base. Commander says, great idea, General. And so they assigned us to the social work division at Madigan Hospital, assigned our group, we called it the Red Badge Project. We assigned our group to the Warrior Transition Battalion, which are the soldiers who are being transitioned out of the Army because they can no longer serve due to physical disabilities, mental and emotional disabilities. And they became our clients, and we became part of their therapy. We were assigned to the social work division, and then later we were transferred to the adaptive therapy unit. We're actually, and we pioneered what's now called narrative medicine, where you use writing as a kind of healing protocol. And so we've been at it for 7 years now, and we've expanded beyond Joint Base Lewis McChord to vet centers around the state. We've added a few more teachers. We started a women's program with some women writers because they have a separate set of issues, a lot of it related to sexual assault in the military. And we put to work those 3 principles that I was talking about earlier. Write what you're trying to learn, not what you already know. Write, you can't change anything that happened to you in the past, but as a writer, you can control that message. And then the third was tell the truth, not the facts. And what we found is that the soldiers and the vets, they don't want to write about combat. They don't want to write about how they got injured. It turns out they want to write about family. They want to write about growing up. And many of them have had horrific childhoods, horrific, on a level that is really unimaginable to me, the stories I've heard. And I think for many of them, they brought PTSD into the Army. And you have to go that far back to try to understand those stories. whether it was about physical abuse or mental abuse, to sexual abuse, as children. And that's quite a journey to be responsible for. And I would say it's not only the most challenging teaching I've ever done, but the most rewarding. We actually see soldiers who have physical disabilities improve in ways, particularly people with traumatic brain injury. The brain actually rewires itself through this creative process. And it's astounding to watch how these young men and women improve.
Shawn, speaking of the creative process and memory, our students will probably want to forget 2020 as a year, and at the same time, it's a year that we'll never forget.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I'm going to ask the students to do is contribute something to 2020, something in the form of a time capsule. And I want to first thank you on behalf of all the students that are taking the course and those that might want to participate, that you've agreed to write something to remember this moment. And this is something that you did September 11th, 2001. You wrote a poem for September 11th, and then you'll write something for this class. A little about what you did then, and about how you're thinking about what you want to contribute to this year.
Yeah, for the students who don't know, the University of Washington, 30 days after September 11th, declared that October 11th was going to be a day of engagement at the university, where the university would shut down and dedicate its resources to learning about what happened on September 11th, whether that was a class about Islam, or whatever expertise we had, we would convert that to learning, dispelling stereotypes, just educating ourselves. And I was amazed. I thought the students, they're getting a day off, they're going to scatter. They did not scatter. They attended these workshops. I think one class had to be moved to the basketball arena in order to accommodate students. And the university asked me to write something to end the day. And talk about writing under pressure. The university said, okay, Shawn, if you're willing to do this, you will have the last word after a day of engagement. And I remember sitting there trying to think, well, what can I say on behalf of all of us, right? And I did write something, and I don't think I've ever been that nervous in my life when I read it in Kane Hall, because you're being asked to speak for everybody, and it's not I don't know, it's very challenging thing to say, okay, this one experience we share, how can I speak for everybody? And so I think the thing I wrote, I just sort of spoke for myself. And I remember the title of the poem was called Calling the Roll. And it was just a narrative about me saying the names of my students out loud and my friends out loud to see if they were present. My friends in New York and my students who are still traveling around the world. All I need to do is have you to say here, and we hope that everybody says that, and it's sort of the same way now, I think, as in our own isolation during COVID, are we here? Are we present?
Shawn, my gratitude to you in advance, because you've decided to, and you said yes. You were the first person I thought of when I thought of asking our faculty to contribute to the course. and to leave something so that we remember 2020 and that we remember it 40 years from now or 100 years from now. So Shawn, thank you for writing for our students, and I hope you, and for our community. And I hope you do just what you did September 11th, which is right from your heart and right from your head. So thank you for doing that, Shawn.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. Thank you for asking.
We'll have you back before long, and no pressure, but we expect something really pretty marvelous.
Okay.
How many days?
I hope so.
We're just happy to have you contribute to the course, and we'll ask our students to write alongside you and contribute something so that we can work of being courageous and just leaving something that we'll look back and remember. Thank you, Shawn.
Yeah, I think they can also participate in this writing effort with me, and since my thing is going to be at the end of the course, it'd be great to see what they have and how I can incorporate that too, and sort of combine our voices together.
We'll go on a journey together. Thanks, Shawn.
Thank you. Bye-bye.